It's John Bowden from Rock History Book, and I'm very delighted to be presenting a person I consider a friend who's brilliant in music. Started off as a young writer, has written articles for so many different music publications. She's been a publicist, and she has a new edition of her book, Songwriters Speak. And if you want to get educated with the fantastic writers that came out of Australia, this is the book to get. Diane Kruger has written the quintessential book about songwriters that came from down under. And the people in this series we talk about, Terry Britton. He wrote that big comeback hit for Cliff Richard, Devil Woman. Also another comeback for Tina Turner, What's Love Got to Do with It? And so many others. For the book, she interviewed John Farah, who was the producer and writer of a lot of Olivia Newton-John's hits. You're the One That I Want being one of the biggies. And speaking of Olivia Newton-John, she also talked to Steve Kipner, who co-wrote her biggest hit, Physical. In this book, the Little River Band, the boys from INXS, Split Enz and Crowded House, Tim and Neil Finn, Colin Hay of Men at Work, and so many more. I just love this book so much, and it's available now. We'll have links in the description where you can pick it up. A new edition just came out, and our special guest is the wonderful Debbie Kruger. Music. Let's start with music. Growing up, when did music become important to you?
I don't remember when it wasn't. I was obsessed with radio, AM radio on a little mono transistor. And I was asking my babysitter to call the radio station to request Conquistador by Procol Harum, the live version. Like, I don't know, I was 9 when I did that. I just loved radio. So by 1973, when I was in grade 6, I was obsessed with Top 40. And Top 40 was My Love by Wings and You're So Vain, Carly Simon. I remember sitting in my bedroom doing a jigsaw puzzle and these songs playing. I remember hearing the Beatles on the radio before they broke up. Michelle. I remember sitting in the bathtub listening to that and singing it. So it was just always a thing. My dad had a reel-to-reel on a big system in the lounge room, the living room. My dad loved Sergio Mendes and Brazil 66 and Herb Alpert. And I actually met Sergio the night before the world shut down with COVID. He did an appearance at the Grammy Museum here in LA. And he was like 80 at that point. And I said, I used to hear you all the time. My dad would play you and dance around the living room, on his reel-to-reel, and I'm here because of my dad. And my ringtone on my phone these days is Brazil 66. It's happy music. So my mum was more into like Rod McEwen, and
Rod McEwen once held the record of having the most records by one artist because he would release a lot of music.
He's so forgotten, isn't he? She even had a Rod McEwen songbook because she loved the poetry of it.
He was a poet.
And my parents liked Roberta Flack and Donny Hathaway, but they also liked Rodgers and Hammerstein. And my dad loved classical, and he got all those Reader's Digest classical record, those big
box sets.
Yeah. So, but I developed my own taste for top 40 radio, popular music. I just did.
Conquistador was recorded 2.5 hours from here in Edmonton.
Get out.
It was recorded with the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra. And it was, long before I got there, but it was. There you go.
What was a 9 or 10-year-old kid, Jewish girl in Sydney, Australia, doing loving Conquistador? You know what it was? It was the drama of the music.
Yes.
And I think that's why I ended up loving Chicago, because the brass was so dramatic in it, or Queen. But always I was listening to lyrics and how melodies wove in with the lyrics. Often the melody was the most memorable thing, and it would take me more listens to understand or hear or remember the lyrics. But pretty much any 70s top 40 song that was a hit in Australia, I would be able to sing to you right now, which we won't do. But
One last thing about that era. What would you tell that girl now? Would you tell her anything?
I would tell her to no, I think I would just tell her, you go, girl, and keep enjoying that music because it's going to stay with you through your entire life. Oh, and I would tell her, you know how lucky you are because kids in the future are not going to get this kind of music.
Oh, well said. That was good. I like that. What's your next steps after that? When you left home, what were you doing?
Oh, well, there's actually a lot in between that because all through my teenage years, I was so obsessed with radio, and the big station in Sydney in the 70s was 2SM, and they would hold these huge free concerts. And I'm sure you've seen the footage of the Little River Band one on the steps of the Sydney Opera House in 1978, the Summer Magic concert. And then at the end of the 70s, in November 79, there was the concert of the decade. And all the great Australian artists of the whole decade came on stage and sang 1 to 4 or 5 of their greatest songs. Little River Band not, because they were touring around America. But I think all that happened was I never, lost the passion. I went and lived in London. I took my cousin and her husband and all their friends to see Little River Band at the Finsbury Park Rainbow. I was like a evangelist for, it's a good word for a Jewish kid, for great music, especially then Australian music. But I actually went in a different direction through my 20s because I wanted to work in theatre, and I wanted to live in London and work in theatre, and I got my master's in theatre and moved to London in 1990. And through that period, while I was still passionate about music and went to concerts and collected music and worked at Variety, I was the writer for Variety and went to a lot of concerts in Sydney, reviewed them for Variety, including John Farnham during the crazy comeback period, and reported on music industry news. But theatre was my passion. And it wasn't actually until I came back to us, went back, because I'm in LA. I've got 3 passports, so I never know where I am. Went back to Australia and then moved to a place called Byron Bay, which is kind of an iconic location up the coast, 800 kilometres up the coast from Sydney, and started doing my own radio program called Debbie Does Music. Debbie Does Breakfast. Debbie Does Music is my music blog. Debbie Does Breakfast. And started playing a lot of that music from the 70s that I loved, from the top 40, and talking about it. And that kind of moved me back into thinking I really need to do more with this knowledge and passion for music. But my career has always been music, film, theatre, and anything else. But writing about music is probably what I'm best known for as a writer at the moment.
You know, the preamble to the interview in the books, I love that. I mean, I pay close attention because I wrote for print, but not on your level. But I pay attention to the writers I like, right? Like the phrasing, the way someone paints the picture. So I like that part just as much as I enjoyed learning during the process of you talking to someone in the interview.
Yeah, thank you. What I tried to do in Songwriters Speak was, set the scene before each interview, which is presented as a Q&A. And I wasn't trying to draw attention to myself by being clever, like a lot of music writers just do. They like, the person I'm writing about is so much more interesting than me, so I'm going to add all these flourishes and opinions and try and be a character in this. And that's not generally what I try to do, but I do find myself, even unconsciously, inserting my innate knowledge and understanding of the subject. Every now and then in one of these introductions, I would be pretty impressed with something that I'd written, and I would cite my Nick Cave chapter introduction and my Tim Finn one.
You were a Nick Cave virgin, you'd said.
You remember? Yeah, well, I was unashamedly new to the whole world of Nick Cave, and I fought really hard to get that interview with him. Not that he didn't want to do it, because he did. His assistant didn't understand and wanted, to try and push me away for months, until I told her, do you understand that if I don't put Nick in this book, it will not be taken seriously? I will be tarred and feathered in the streets in Australia. No one will accept this book there if Nick Cave is missing. So you've got to let me have Nick, and I'm coming to England and I want to sit down with Nick. And she said, well, you can have an hour. And he gave me 3. And he was very happy to have me. And he said, I knew what you were doing with this. I always wanted to do it. And every hour on the hour, the assistant would ring. She's still there. Why? He'd go, darling, leave us alone. We're fine. So, often it was the people that you have to go through, and you would know this, the people you have to go through to get to an artist who are obstructive. And in a few instances, it meant that I didn't get the songwriter I wanted to interview. But yes, I was happy to tell Nick, look, I was a Nick Cave virgin. This was not the music I was listening to. And I told him I was a Sherbet fan and a Little River Band fan. And he said, and you probably thought I was some kind of, dark, sinister asshole kind of guy. And, I went, yeah. And then I listened to you and I educated myself. And what
did you learn? What did you learn about Nick Cave?
Oh, that he's incredibly funny. He's got a wicked sense of humor, and a lot of you think about a clown, and Nick's not a clown, but there's a very sad side to a clown. I mean, Nick is just a guy who's very devotional, or was. I haven't spoken to him since then. Who saw the humorous side in many things, but his way of depicting that was through dark, macabre, sad pictures, but not always. I just found when I listened and I studied the lyrics that there was a lot more in there than his, perceived persona might lead somebody to believe. And he says in the interview, look, I know I'm not for everyone, and I don't care. I'm actually going to see him in concert here in Los Angeles next month, and it will be the first time I've seen him since around the time I interviewed him perform. I've only ever seen him perform once before in Sydney. So he's been through so much in his life since then that it will be really interesting.
He's an icon. He really is. I only started paying attention to him when he was in a relationship with PJ Harvey. I remember going, now she's an interesting person. She's could never get around to sort of figuring her out.
Well, I guess I only ever really thought about him when he did that duet with Kylie Minogue. And Kylie was, way back then, she was a clever girl. She had a relationship with Michael Hutchence. She recorded with Nick. Kylie is, you might have heard, she's not a songwriter as such, and she's not in my book, but she is such an icon and a survivor, and she's doing a season in Vegas, and she's actually doing a conversation at the Grammy Museum next week. And I suspect it was the quickest sellout of a Grammy Museum event since Barbra Streisand. I couldn't get a ticket to Barbara back in 2016 at the Grammy Museum, but I'm going to watch Kylie talk next week about her career, because putting her in the context of America is fascinating to me. I've only known her as an Australian legend and being so huge in the UK. But that's getting off the topic. Look, I think one of the things that I wanted to do with this book, which is Australian and New Zealand or songwriters whose careers originated in Australia and New Zealand. Many of them immigrants from Europe and the UK. Many of them went back, but or moved to America. But a lot of them were not as widely known to the general public as others. And at the time my book came out, I was really gratified that it did give more exposure to songwriters who'd written amazing work, but who hadn't been recognized as highly.
Christina Amphlett, the Divinals was a band. I used to look at that band and go, that girl's got a lot of energy. She gives out fairly, back then, sometimes sharp interviews, a lot of angst in that music back then. What was it like talking to her?
Chrissy was charming. We did it in a hotel room in Sydney, because she was living in New York at the time, but she was back in Australia to do something or another. So she was staying in a hotel room, a very elegant hotel room, and she didn't want any lights on. So we only had a bit of light coming through the window. She was so earnest about sharing her story with me and said to me, nobody ever considered me as a songwriter. I was always viewed as this wild rock chick performer. And the thing I'm most proud of is my songwriting. So we kept in touch afterwards, and she did her own memoir, and she invited me to the launch, and it was such a lovely experience to see her and congratulate her. And sadly, we lost her way too early. She was just a lovely woman. But, I met her when she was past all that wild rock chick stuff. It's interesting to think if she'd survived, if she'd not gotten cancer and died, if the Divinals, as so many other bands have, would have, come back together and done a heritage tour, and how she might have presented herself on stage nowadays. But yeah, she was beautiful, to be honest. She was just beautiful to spend time with.
What was Rolf Harris like? He's a polarizing figure, and I know that I read what you said in the beginning. Just skip that chapter if you want to. I grew up, Canadians. So there's a thing about Australians and Canadians. We're all part of the monarchy, so somehow there's a connection with. But what was he like?
Look, yeah, it was 2004, and I was in the UK to do a few interviews for the book, and I went to Rolf's home, and he was charming, he was friendly, he was affable, he was very generous with his stories, and I got a photo taken with him by his wife, and it was delightful, because who knew? Nobody knew at the time what would come to light later. And there was certainly no untoward behavior from him. He was delightful and charming on the day. I thought it was a good interview, and that's why I decided to retain it in the book, because the book is not just about the songwriters, it's about the art of interview, and how you can get such good responses from an interview subject if you ask questions in a certain way, and if you demonstrate your knowledge and understanding, or your willingness to learn and understand. There's one theory that you should never ask a question that you don't already know the answer to. I think that's nonsense. I think ask questions when you genuinely want to know the answer, and then decide whether that answer is something you'll take on board or not. So I did fact checking with some of the songwriters, but there was nothing that Rolf told me that didn't make sense. And it's just sad what ended up happening and what came to light, and he died a very disgraced, sad old man. But I stand by the interview. That's why I kept it in the new release of the book.
It was very interesting. I like the fact you asked him about his version of Stairway to Heaven, and he hadn't heard the original version, he said?
Yeah.
How could he have not heard it? Like, I'm going,
I don't know about that. I mean, look, he was a raconteur and a storyteller, so who knows what stories he was telling to sound good. It could be that he was just given the sheet music, and he was musically classically trained. I mean, he sat there and wrote the musical notation for Timey Kangaroo Down Sport and gave it to me to take home with me. So there weren't that many songwriters that were properly trained as musicians who could read music.
Vanda and Young, that must have been fun talking to those guys, huh?
Well, George Young I had to do remotely because he was based in France, and Harry I already knew through previous work from when I worked at APRA, the Australasian Performing Rights Association, and Harry was kind of the main spokesperson for the whole Vanda and Young legacy. He'd set up a great cutting edge at the time studio in Sydney, and he loved telling stories. But similarly, both of them were very offhand and almost dismissive about some of their greatest work. Oh, that was no big deal. Like, I still think that the best Australian song ever is Evie, parts 1, 2, and 3, recorded by Stevie Wright. It's epic, it's sweeping, it's beautiful. It's a song with 3 movements, and Harry's like, yeah, well, no, I didn't really like the middle part. Okay, yeah. So, but it was not just their work, their early work with the Easy Beats and their work with Stevie after the Easy Beats. It was their songs for John Paul Young and their production and other artists that they wrote and produced for. I don't think there's been a songwriting duo with as great an impact on Australian music as Vanda and Young. There's certainly been higher selling songwriters, and in fact George's little brothers Angus and Malcolm and AC/DC have certainly, as songwriting exports and music that they've earned money from, would probably be the biggest. I wasn't allowed to interview them, which was annoying.
Why?
Because the people or person who was at the time the gatekeeper for them, who was the same person who was the gatekeeper for Vanda and Young and helped me a great deal with Vanda and Young, but that person said that it would not be possible for me to interview Angus and Malcolm, and I then went around that person to their New York management, who pinged it back to the Sydney person who wrote and said, I told you, you can't do it. And
I've done that.
Yeah, the shame of that was that, mutual friends of theirs who I knew in the industry would say to me, well, this sucks because Malcolm would really, really love to do something like this. They never feel that they're appreciated for their songwriting talent. Same thing as Chrissy Amphlett and James Rain from Australian Crawl, and a bunch of other songwriters who were in bands or were solo artists who were always seen as pop stars or rock stars. Australia is all about the performer. That's why John Farnham is the biggest male music artist that's ever been in Australia. He's got an incredible voice. Not much, he didn't write much. His most famous songs were written by other people. But that's how Australians are. So I wanted also my book to, make people think a bit more about where this music comes from. Very Britain.
Harry Britton, writing Tina Turner, Cliff Richard, Olivia Newton-John, Status Quo, or Status, as we say here. Michael Jackson. Tell me about him.
Harry Britton was one of my favorite experiences of visiting someone. And he was lovely and very nicely spoken, you know, articulate, but also like a lot of, I mean, he was originally from the UK, moved to Australia and formed the Twilights with Glenn Shorrock and others, and then went back to the UK, but very sort of self-effacing and, I don't really, you know, think of myself as a songwriter. And there's his Ivor Novello and his Grammy, and What's Love Got to Do With It is one of the most career-defining songs for any artist. And Devil Woman was a real kind of pivotal song for Cliff Richard and brought him back in a much more grown-up pop sensibility kind of way. I mean, you know, Terry had a kind of style in his songwriting, and I, as a more critical observer, I see and hear songwriters repeat themselves or reference themselves, and then they don't like to have that pointed out. But you can hear the Devil Woman thing in Goosebumps by Christy Allen, who was an Australian pop star for 5 minutes, that Terry wrote that song for. But it was a really classy pop music style. And if it was formulaic at all, it was a good formula to write with. But he had great stories about working with Tina, about convincing her to record What's Love Got to Do With It, and, you know, to just hold back and pull back with the vocal. When Tina died, not so long ago, you know, Harry's part in her story wasn't as remembered as much as other things. And I was on the verge of putting on my music blog the entire Terry Britton chapter as a kind of gift and tribute to Tina. And then I don't know, I re-released the book, and I thought, why am I giving anything away? But I think I might eventually do that, maybe on the anniversary of Tina's death or something, because it's such a beautiful conversation that I had with him.
I like the fact that Alan Clark of the Hollies was walking by and he heard it, and he broke his head out and said, "That's a hit," with the Devil Woman.
Yeah, there are a lot of stories like that in the book. It's kind of a vast world and a small world as well, with a lot of these. I mean, Alan Clark's not in the book, obviously, he's not Australian, but a lot of these personalities overlapping and interweaving in each other's stories. So, for example, someone like John Farah, that was very much up there in one of my favorite interviews that I did. He's not as forthcoming as, say, a Nick Cave or a Tim Finn or a Don Walker from Cold Chisel, because John has always found it difficult to talk about himself and his work process. But as I said to him, you know, you wrote You're the One That I Want, period. Is it the most highly complex, deep song of all time? Hell no. Is there anyone in the world that hates it? I hope not, because why would you? It's like, it's pop perfection, and it evokes a time. It evokes images, of course, from the movie Grease. It evokes beautiful Olivia and John Travolta, and just so much joy, and so much of what came before it. You know, John's trajectory in his career, and all the other songs that get mentioned in my book that he played guitar on, or that he was involved in producing, or it's I love that. The book has a song index, so you can really see where a particular song has traveled and who has traveled through it. But John, I've interviewed him twice, because I also did interviews for some years for the Australian National Film and Sound Archive, their oral history program. And both times, you know, John is shy in talking about himself. I know he had to get used to it a bit more, because in the last years of Olivia's life, there was more and more attention paid to her legacy and who was behind it. And so John would get honors and people would want to talk to him, but I think he still kept that to a minimum. But I think he's an Australian national treasure, but he's lived here in the LA area for so many years that when he is back in Australia, it's very under the radar and people don't know he's there.
I guess he and Olivia, he had said to you that they didn't really click right away, but it didn't really take that long as far as like just the groove of them working together.
Yeah, well, you know, she had that voice. And it was one of those big world, small world things. He fell in love with Olivia's singing partner, Pat Carroll, and they got married, and that's one of the longest music marriages ever. And it was a nice small circle of influence and love that they were all in. I think probably the big breakthrough was when he produced I Honestly Love You in this little studio in London. And it became such a worldwide hit and won a Grammy or two. And then they moved to America, and just she became the icon she became. I use that word too much, but
nope.
But John's work cannot be, the importance of John Farah's work cannot be understated. Like Olivia, I just don't know that she would have had the incredible career and length of career had it not been for John Farah.
Glenn Shorrock, Help Is On Its Way is my favorite Little River Band song. Sometimes people say, not reminiscing. Well, I love reminiscing, but I can't help what I like the best. Glenn, I interviewed Glenn. He's an interesting character.
Yeah, he's very dry, laconic. Very different personalities in that band, as everyone knows. You know, the Australia's version of Crosby, Stills and Nash, really. You know, incredible harmony, but internal disharmony. Yeah, Glenn's a real character and a beautiful voice. And my favorite Little River Band song is Graham Goble's song, Mistress of Mine, which was an album cut. But Cool Change is probably my favorite Shorrock song, and beautiful. You know, for a guy who, you know, was brought up in Britain and had all the hang-ups that Brits do about, you know, don't big note yourself and always very sarcastic, he wrote some beautifully personal songs. He really put his passion into his songs. Home on a Monday, you know, based on a very true story about a phone call with his wife, Jo. Yeah, Glenn was a friend of mine for a long time. Yeah, lovely guy.
Tim Finn, you did the exception to the rule, New Zealand, but of course.
Well, no, it was actually Australasian songwriters, because I couldn't not include the Finns, and a couple of other New Zealanders are in the book as well.
Okay. Did you know Tim before all this?
No, I just reached out, and asked, I think, through his management probably for an interview, but it wasn't the kind of thing that would be hard to get. Tim was, has always been very generous in talking to people about his work. But and you know this, you sit down and start interviewing someone and you're like, oh my God, I hope the recording's working. This is so quotable. This is so quotable. This is, oh my God, he just spoke poetry to me. This is so, where did that come from? His mind. And you're listening and you want to make sure you might have a follow-up question based on it, but you keep thinking, this is incredible. And that was Tim Finn for me. It was, I loved how his mind worked and how he talked about his work. And he was very open with me. And we did it in 2 parts. We did the first half in Sydney and we ran out of time. And I said, well, I'm coming to Auckland in a couple of months to interview Neil. And he said, oh, come over and we'll finish. So I went to his home and we finished. And then I interviewed Neil the next day and Tim came to visit. So that's when I got a great photo with both brothers, which is, amazing moment. Yeah, they're such great guys. Tim's actually just been touring in Australia on the back of, I think, a new album release and doing interviews. And he's like an elder statesman of music down there now. But his origins in Split Enz, who were, an art rock group from New Zealand and came over the pond to Australia, and totally bizarre and fabulous, colourful band. Legendary. And Tim was probably my number one favorite interview to do.
It's interesting. He talks about, going through clinical depression, going into Time and Tide with, juggling a lot. He was dealing with all that, threw it into the work. And
yeah, he was just very open with me in a way that more artists are these days. I mean, look at Rick Springfield and his memoir, where he writes in depth about depression and suicide and addictions, and that's kind of, that's a brutally frank memoir, but it's de rigueur now for any artist, particularly in music, to be very confessional. But back 20 years ago, not so. People were still, a lot of these songwriters were in between their classic era and that heritage touring circuit era that came sometime after. And some of them were not sure whether their careers were going to endure because nobody would take their new work seriously. They would still write and record, but everyone just wanted to hear the old hits from the 70s or 80s. And, I was doing these interviews from 2002 to 2004. So I captured some of these people in very self-reflective times when they recognized that I had their best interests at heart and wanted to tell honest stories. And so they were very open with me. I really appreciated that.
I like Steve Kipner saying he was co-writing Physical, but they didn't want to write a love song that day. So that came out. A song that was banned in like 2 states in the US. What the hell?
Well, 6 months, just going back to Tim Finn briefly, 6 months in a leaky boat, the Split Enz song was banned in the UK because it was released during the Falklands War. So, I guess the Thatcher government or whoever her reps were in the BBC thought, oh no, that might make people think that the Navy boats are all going to sink. So ludicrous. Let's Get Physical was, originally thought of for Rod Stewart.
And I could see that.
But how clever was Olivia? Because she was very, very uncomfortable about it. She recorded it and she gave an incredible performance of it on the record. But then she was like, oh my God, I can't do this. So let's make this about aerobics. You know, when Jane Fonda's got aerobic videos coming out, when everyone's signing up for gyms. How brilliant, you know? Olivia was very clever.
Genie in a bottle. I mean, Christina Aguilera, it was Britney Spears at the Grammys. Christina Aguilera, who wins for Best New Artist? It was the girl who sang Genie in the Bottle. I'll never forget that. And I was happy about that. And he co-wrote that.
Yeah, Steve's a very clever guy, whip smart, and you know, he had a really smart father. His father was very instrumental in the Bee Gees having a career in the early years. And it's interesting because Steve had written Let's Get Physical for Olivia. He'd written or co-written Hard Habit to Break for Chicago. And then he just figured out that the way to move forward, which John Farah, I don't think, wanted to so much, was to identify emerging pop stars and be a part of their trajectory. And so that became Steve's mission, to work with rising stars and not just write their songs, but be very involved in all aspects of that song. So he would call himself a record writer rather than a songwriter.
He was working with when the Hard Habit to Break era, when Olivia was doing Twist of Fate with John Travolta. It's, you know, speaking of David Foster and this ilk, this lane, it's interesting how the David Foster documentary never mentions Umberto Gatica once.
Listen, the David Foster documentary is about David Foster and all his Grammys. And remember that moment where he's got all those Grammys on the piano and he said, well, here I am. It's like, all right, you know, that's a perfect study in ego.
Yeah, I'd love to. I always wanted to talk to Umberto Gatica. I always wanted to.
Yeah, look, there are a lot of people that worked with Chicago between Gershio and Foster and after Foster, but because the David Foster period, and this is a whole other subject, but I did choose Hard Habit to Break for the CD that accompanied, that was released at the same time as my book. There was a double CD of Songwriters Speak, and I chose the tracks. And I chose to represent Steve Kipner, Hard Habit to Break, because I thought, how else am I going to ever get a Chicago song on an Australian CD? But people do hone in on the David Foster period because it was very controversial for a band like Chicago to change that dramatically. There aren't a lot of bands, you could talk about Heart to an extent, who recorded Diane Warren songs and you know, to keep vital in the 80s, but a band whose sound changed so dramatically from the 13th and 14th, which was a bit of a Turkey album, to, you know, then 15 was the greatest hits, and then 16, and it's like you put it on the turntable and you're like, is this really Chicago? Okay. But, you know, it captured the zeitgeist of the time, as to use a cliche, and it resurrected them, and here they are today in whatever form they are, which is a whole other conversation.
Or another time. Neil Finn, what's the difference between those two brothers to you?
Oh, Tim, well, what's the difference? They're different guys. Neil's the one who's been more commercially successful in his own right, with Crowded House, which really, really broke in America. And I mean, look at him now. He performed with Fleetwood Mac, and Neil was a real melody guy. I mean, his lyrics are brilliant also, but so many comparisons to Paul McCartney. So you might, if you wanted to, and I'm not saying I do, say that, you know, if you were comparing the Lennon and McCartney thing, then Tim was the Lennon and Neil was the McCartney. And but what I found at the time, and I've never met Neil since, is that Tim was just more open and generous with himself, with his personal life and his stories. And Neil was more guarded. You know, great stories, but I think I had to pry a little bit more.
I found it's interesting. Neil says he didn't like the chorus from "I Got You." I think it was strong. I'm like, what?
The verses are what makes that song. That's very, you know, those what's the word? They might have even used it in the interview. Kind of spooky almost, you know, chorus. Verse, sorry. It's I'm not going to sing it, but I'm hearing it. I mean, True Colors was such a big deal when it came out. It was a landmark in so many ways. But Neil was so young, you know.
I remember True Colors being laser etched. I remember that was so I'm going, wow, that's artsy, man. That's so cool. I've never had an album do that before.
But my favorite track on it is Shark Attack, the opening track. And it makes me think of opening tracks like Death on Two Legs on A Night at the Opera and Queen, and, you know, really great opening tracks that you go, wow, that's incredible. That's so different. It's not what I'm expecting. But I hope I never. Oh, that's just one of the most profoundly sad, dramatic, self-pitying songs ever. I love that song. So I liked the conversation with Tim about that. But Neil, yeah, I mean, you know, they're just a marvelous pair of men. Creative, brilliant. You know, they're you look at siblings, the Gibb brothers, the Finn brothers, and I don't know if they were ever known in Canada, but the Hunter brothers in Dragon, the New Zealand band, and I interviewed Todd and his wife Joanna in my book. There's something about the way they sound together, and that DNA. How do you know, if you could bottle that, imagine.
Speaking of that, the Ferris brothers, Andrew Ferris on here. I just went into his website this morning. He's got a great website. I mean,
I haven't looked. What's he up to?
Well, basically, I mean, in some album covers, he looks like a cowboy. He's got are you going into it? You should check it out.
I'm watching you.
Okay. Anyway, well, What You Need You Tonight, Never Tear Us Apart, Suicide Blonde. I mean, that band grabbed me by the jugular and didn't let go. I love that band.
That band was very much about sound. And, you know, obviously I would have loved to interview Michael Hutchence, but he was already gone. And it hadn't been that long. So Andrew was still in shock, I think, at the time I spoke to him, and trying to understand a world without Michael in it. And Andrew, particularly his music world, without Michael in it. But what was great about talking to Andrew Farris was that the INXS sound was the thing. I mean, the lyrics, you know, were fine. And obviously their stage act and Michael's charisma, which was really, you know, a kind of almost Jim Morrison-esque kind of vibe. He was so interesting.
True.
And oozing sensuality and mystery, and but he was apparently, you know, I only met him once briefly, you know, apparently quite shy and but brilliant, and they were a brilliant songwriting pair. but the sound, the grooves, you know, they just tapped into that whole MTV 80s soundscape kind of era really well, in the same way that Duran Duran did in what they did. There were particular sounds then that INXS just were, you know, definitely leaders in.
The Vegemite Sandwich Band. Colin Hay.
Have you said that to Colin Hay? I'm sure he'll appreciate it.
Yeah, I know. How many times he heard that, eh? Jeez.
I don't know.
Oh, it's got to be
Sandwich Band.
I didn't know. Well, first of all, business as usual. I used to drive one of those old 78 Trans Am with the funky chicken on the hood, with the hawk on the hood, you know. I used to be driving that thinking I was cool. And I remember the first album I bought, when I bought that album, was Business as Usual. And I was right in line for Cargo right after that. And I was just getting into radio at that time. What was he like?
Oh, Colin is a joy. He's lovely. And I went in June, a few months ago, to see Ringo Starr and his all-star band, which the current lineup includes Colin. And you've got Steve Lukather and Edgar Winter and Hamish Stewart and Colin Hay. And sitting in the Greek Theatre of Los Angeles and hearing, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people, however many people sit there, sing Colin songs to him. Colin, it was quite profound because I hadn't seen him perform to a big crowd in America before. And he still sings incredibly beautifully. He is very, very funny. He's a Scot. Oh my God. You want to talk about dry? Yeah, he's a character, and you know he's made a career in his later years in touring around, being a storyteller of around his songs. Interesting connections, you know. His wife Cecilia was previously married to Tris Imboden, who'd been in Chicago, and I knew Cecilia from those days, and I went to their house in Topanga Canyon, and she's like, oh, when Colin and I got married, it was such a big story in Australia. And she brought out all these Australian magazines to show me, and she was so chuffed that, you know, Colin is such a national treasure back in Australia, but he lives the life of a true songwriting artist in Topanga Canyon, in the woods in LA, and he is a gentleman, you know, that old expression, a gentleman and a scholar. He's clever. He's very clever, and he's just lovely. I've always hoped to sit down and chat to him again. It's never happened, but Colin, if you're watching this, let's catch up. I'm in Santa Monica.
Colin, why do you think he hasn't? Does he not own the name Men at Work? Why hasn't he done what so many lead singers do, and just get the, you know, because people know?
Oh, I don't know. You'll have to ask him. You know, there's a lot of sadness that's happened around that band with the lawsuit, and Greg Ham, and Colin. You know that. I mean, he talks about why the band ended. That wasn't necessarily the life he wanted. And he did a tour and called it Man at Work. So, you know, he trades on the Men at Work legacy, but it was primarily him and his songs. So, and his voice, his incredible voice.
Remember, there are links in the description where you can pick up the book right now. You'll find those links at the very top of the description. Also, if you want to make a donation to Rock History Book, there's a PayPal link right at the very top. You can join our Patreon and get early access to our videos. And we'd love for you to subscribe to our channel. There's a link to all our channels in the description. Share them on social media, comment, like them, just spread the word. We'd appreciate that. I'm John Bowden. This is Rock History Book. Take care.